Buenas tardes a todos nuevamente.
Good afternoon. Once again, we will start this parallel session called Lessons for a Sustainable and Resilient Development. We would like to remind you that we are in the framework of the 8th Regional Platform for the Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas and the Caribbean. This session is being hosted in hybrid mode. So apart from those of us here in the room, we also have virtual participant using the Hopin platform. For those who are joining us online, we would like to remind you two important topics or issues. First, on your right-hand side, you have the option to listen to the simultaneous interpretation and also subtitling in the case the conference is not in your language. You can also review the different instances in the agenda by clicking on the etapas, stages on your left hand. This session's been organized by the Central American Institute of Public Administration and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Alejandra Barragan, she is a technical advisor for the Global Initiative for Disaster Risk Management promoted by GIZ in Colombia, and she will be our moderator. She works in Colombia, mainly. She's based in Colombia. Alejandra, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for this introduction. It's a pleasure to be here moderating this panel, Lessons Learned for a Sustainable and Resilient Development. First of all, we would like to explain the dynamics of the panel, and we would love to have your engagement and participation using the Slido platform. You will see a QR code that you can scan and start adding your comments or answering the questions using your answers. For those of you who are joining us online using the Hopin platform, you can also connect to the Slido platform with the code that you can see here. You will be able to also answer and add comments. It's my pleasure to give the floor, to introduce our experts in the panel. First, we have Dr. Alan Lavelle. He's a specialist in urban and regional development, a technical advisor and consultant for the Sorry for this interruption. For the IBD, ICAP, and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in the Americas and Caribbean. Then Andrew Musgrave, he won't be able to be here in situ, but he will be participating virtually. He's an expert at the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure of India. Then Patricia Carrillo, National Director of Risk Management of the Ministry of Education, and Alice Brenes, responsible for the disaster risk area of the Office of the Extension Vice President of the National University of Costa Rica. After this, let's say we hope to have also your active participation. And now let's start with the questions. Andrew, who's joining us virtually. Good afternoon, Andrew. We would like to ask you this first question. What is the balance of the last 30 years of investment in disaster risk reduction? Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today, even though it's in this virtual format. I think the question is not really hard to answer, but I think that numbers and figures that I will be giving you directly answer the question. We have 3 challenges right now in the world. The first is to achieve complying or the achievement of the Sustainable Development Targets or goals without houses, without facilities, without infrastructure. We cannot talk about any investment in disaster risk reduction because there wouldn't be anything at all. The second challenge is achieving net zero, and is economies that are not depending on the climate change crisis. And the third challenge is achieving or by 2040, 2050 is the concept of resilience. Okay, over the past 30 years, I think it's obvious that we haven't achieved that. Why? Because the figures that we now have about losses and damages and also the future risk still point to a big percentage of new investment, whether it's in roads, water infrastructure, sewage, infrastructure, safety, is still dedicated to recovery and reconstructions of infrastructures and buildings that have been damaged or even completely lost to previous disasters. So the fact that this is still a reality is the proof of the fact that we haven't achieved that much over the past 30 years. That leads us to a couple challenges that we should be facing in the short run. The last estimates that we can really do by combining data from different sources, and only for low and medium average income countries, for these three things, the net zero, sustainable development goals, and resilience, are around $2.84 trillion a year. That means $0.84 trillion every year. The money that really includes private and public investment and what is available for climate change adaptation is in those countries around $80 billion. So that's a difference, a proportion of 15:1 between what's needed and what is actually being currently invested. So, as I say, if to this we add the fact that a part of this money that is available is not really for new investment, but to recovery, reconstruction, all that is damaged, we are really talking around twofold proportion between what is there and what is needed. This is again a demonstration of what we haven't achieved in the last 30 years. And my last point here, and I think I am using up my 5 minutes, where will future money come from? It's not going to come from the air. So what we have right now on the table in terms of financing for our climate change adaptation is not enough. So definitely this will require private sector investment. Again, estimates are around $106 trillion in private capital, in pension funds, wealth funds, and other sorts of this type of institutional funds that are not compromised. So there's money there. But then again, what is the type of incentives for these investments to be dedicated to disaster risk reduction and resilience? One of the things that we are seeing in the project, in the CDRI, is that if we invest in resilience, what are the incentives there? From the academic point of view, we could say that there are many benefits of resilience. Losses and damages are reduced for the constructions and buildings. Costs are reduced in terms of disruption of services. There can also be benefits in terms of reduction of carbon emission, protection of biodiversity, etc., etc. The problem is that right now, none of these benefits really turn into the hands of the investor. It goes to the communities or the governments or the world in general. That is a fact. And also a fact is that nobody wants to invest without private return, so to say, incentive. So there is something that is the heart of the problem is develop financing instruments and mechanisms so that part of the benefits from resilience may turn into the private investors, so that a part of that big mass of capital that is trying to find where to invest could be invested in low and medium income countries in actions that really strengthen resilience. And with this, I will just like to end here my participation because I used up my 5 minutes that were allocated to me. Okay, as you can see in the Slido tool, after listening to what Andrew just said, that even though over the past 30 years there has been many actions, they haven't been enough. I would like to ask our panelists if they want to add anything else to what we have just heard. Alice, do you want to start? Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, coming as I come from a public university, I think that this challenge of investment, linking it to science and technology in the framework of universities, well, we must say that science and technology is being produced and also professionals are being trained to design infrastructures that are resilient. As for investment, the trend is, and we were just talking about this in the workshop, in the previous workshop, the trend is to reduce budgets dedicated by countries to the public university, to train, to research, in this relationship between society and university. But this is a challenge for the agenda and budgeting. But we shouldn't forget about it because that is our basis, allowing us to develop knowledge and make it available to public and private investment. Thank you, Alice. Alan? Well, very quickly, good afternoon. Data mentioned by Andrew are really awesome, even including an underestimation of damages and losses if we take into account systemic risk. We are facing a situation after 30 years of very valuable punctual actions that have never been extrapolated to a wider scale of a substantial change. So my question is, what is the mechanism? What are the arguments that we need to use to ensure that a context that obviously is damaging becomes a political and social problem that has been constructed? There is no problem in our world that is not social, politically constructed, and this exists for centuries until there's a change in the public policies. For instance, contamination, pollution in London, and I know it very well. In 1952, a change meant a complete transformation. What are the incentives in the context, in adverse context? Thank you, Alan. Patricia, please. Good afternoon. Well, when we analyze micro context in my country, I could say that over the past 30 years, the investment in this risk reduction certainly improved. But there are two lines here. First is advancement in knowledge about risk and research to try and prevent some of the risk in the future. And the second line is connected to risk reduction. However, this is only an estimation because the breach, the gap in our country, and I think it's common to the rest of the region, is that we don't have a record of data of all that has been invested by the country, by the state, in all the themes and sub-themes to work on risk prevention. In the case of my country, we are still studying a project of a study of risk and investment. Anyway, from the institutionalization of risk management, that is something we still need to do, but is getting momentum. And that is our main challenge right now. Thank you, Patricia. That was very interesting. From all the panelists, in answer to what Andrew said about investment in knowledge, investment in reduction, and also validation of financing mechanisms allowing us to enlarge our resilience. Andrew, would you like to add anything else after listening to the other panelists? And no, I just wanted to say that as the Ecuadorian colleague, there has been advance and progress in different areas and countries, such as in Peru, with the public investment line over the decade of the 2000. The problem is that those advances, that progress has not been consistent. There was an advance and a change in government, a step back, then changes in the governments. There has not been a consistency in the forward advance. So, as I say, even though we had consistent policies in place and robust policies in place, there is a problem. That is a problem related to a lack of resources. And that is not something that can be done through public investment, even though public investment is the best quality possible. Andrew, thank you so much for your participation. It's such a pity that you're not here with us, but we really thank you for your time and your willingness to participate. Let's listen to the next question to Patricia. From your point of view, how could we orient public and private investment to contribute to the development of resilient territories? Thank you very much, Alejandra. As Andrew just said, the fact that we don't have a comprehensive approach integrating all the sectors towards one common goal, and depending on a country-level policy with this lack of consistency, problem is that the resources are not really used in the best way. There are many resources that have been dedicated to research, but they not necessarily meet their goal or their objective of investment. On the other hand, actions in prevention and mitigation really are able to produce knowledge when we want to manage risk. But what I mean is that there are resources that have been too fragmentedly used. to the different factors of risk management. And this is a challenge. The challenge is to integrate all the public policies aspects. From the technical point of view, we said how risk should be managed with a systemic approach, and we should insist in all the different components that together with the risk management should be more efficient. Right now, we see this disproportion, as Andrew said, but if we are able to integrate all the public policies, we will be able to add in the national agendas, urban agenda, climate change agenda. We have, due to our diversity, the Amazonian agenda, coastal territories agendas, and then all together we are able to take these policies down to the local level and the communities level. And that way, goals will be better represented. And about multi-sectoral public policies, integration would be needed to really answer and identify risks with the better financing sources, because of course we know that the public sector is not enough. Then we would be able to get better results also with planning, not just on the short run, but on the medium and long run. And these plans should be respected, even though there are changes in governments. And then we could avoid these cuts, these step backs, and we need to keep in mind this long-term planning in the framework of risk management.
Thank you, Patricia. Andrew, would you like to complete Patricia's input to this question? Well, something I would add that hasn't been said yet is the problem of the relation between the central and national or the local level, because the countries had been successful at a regulation level, at a national level, implementing planning schedules or how to integrate risk in public investments, etc. But those aspects faces a reality, especially in the local governments, not much in the cities, in the big cities, but in the small towns and in the rural areas. These municipalities have a development plan or adaptation to climate change or risk adaptation plans. And then you reach the municipality and you realize that in the best case scenario, there is only one architect or one engineer who is qualified in the whole municipality. So I think this is a problem that hasn't been solved yet. We should strengthen the normative or the regulation aspects, but without having the capacities at the local level so that regulations can be actually implemented. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Alan? Well, briefly, this is a question that has to do with governance, because it's obvious that it is key to give value to coherence and to the way to achieve those same things in private and public sector. And we also have to see the role of the state facing the private world. And we have to accept, unfortunately, that during the last 30 years, the state has been to the service of the private sectors. So it's difficult to be consistent in terms of social justice equity, economic growth in the short run. Thank you, Alan. Alice? Yes, the question and reflection, and after speaking with colleagues, and this also has to do with public investment, and in Costa Rica and in the region at large, the secretaries or the planning ministries have somehow become partners, and they have started with transformations related to governance, trading. So we have reached a threshold in which everything's ready. But what happens, well, when we look at the results of the infrastructures, it has not been built in the best way possible. So that is when we have the questioning on how investment ends up being wasted. So this is very interesting because we related to the policies, the regulations, but at the time of drafting the terms of reference, that is when everything falls apart. And here's when we have the private sector and they will build these. And there are circles where we cannot close or wrap up the whole history, and there are some loose ends. And as the colleague was saying, we still need an institutional culture or an institutionalization where the changes of government, of administration, are not going to do only their own will, but sometimes we don't speak about political wills, but we also need more consistent public investment to what we want to drive, because these budgets in the end are in national development plans. Please don't leave the cell phones near the mics because there is interference. Patricia, yes, what we reflected here leads us to think that the road ahead is to strengthen these governance process, but not only thinking in national frameworks, but we also have to get to these instruments, and we have to deal with territory problems. And Andrew have also mentioned the capabilities and the reasons in the terms of the community aspects. In all the projects we have, this is what the community needs, and what I'm going to do in that community. Does that community needs that? How does national public policy and local public policy contribute to it? And how am I going to solve these problems the community faces? And if this is a program that is not oriented towards the needs of the population at large. So that is when I talk about integrating public policies, multi-level, multi-sectorial with the national public policy. And this will help us to have planning instruments and to have as a DNA this topic of risk reductions, which help us to contribute with these areas, so as not to create greater risks, but to work on the already existing ones. Thank you, Patricia. Okay, so we can see that these elements that our panelists mentioned are very much in line with the responses given by the public through a Slido, both on site or online. We see as a first measure that we highlight of the strengthening of the capabilities of the local and national governments, and that is related to what the panelists were mentioned some seconds ago. These criteria have been selected through a selection of expert criteria And we see that they are greatly related with these topics that the experts here and Andrew of online have related at this time. So thank you for your contributions. So we're going to go on with the panelists, and we have a question for Alan. Which are the keys to manage those events in an isolated way and with scalability? I suggest to locate what we are using as a reference, the discourse and the concept between this division between extensive risk, intensive risk. It has to do with everyday risk. And this is formulated based on the intensive risk or intensive disaster. And it is created within the context of the chicken points, the existing disasters. So when we speak about the long term of recurrency or scalability, well, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce that word in English, but we're speaking about the intensity and magnitude. However, and we are referring to human and infrastructure impact, and this may be so because it is foreseen or not, because it is what we call of emerging disaster. And it is obvious that if we analyze the causes, we have to talk about compensatory responses and post-impact recovery. And on the other side, it's what we call prospective and collective management. However, this can happen tomorrow, or it can happen in 100 years. So it's not easy to answer such question, because sometimes we cannot be prepared, or the collective sections cannot be prepared, and that is different from foreseeing that an isolated event will happen in 50 years when the prospective management can be relevant, but the preparatory management or the preparedness management has to be updated on new scenarios in the future with new conditions. I'm going to end by referring, and I hope to make you see something, with a text of King Shui of 1982 on the idea of calamity and technocratic unity, where he established a basic principle that the disasters, the crises, and the catastrophes do not represent the fracture with the continuity. They are the continuity of the everyday life. So what does this mean? That in our daily life, this contributes to the future risks. And this is obvious that prospective management and the planning in the future on the use of soil and environmental management has to do the one that addresses risk control in the society. This is the challenge of the sustainable development. But the absolute answer to the question depends on the evolution of scenarios and the occurrence, but the three modalities can be based in particular circumstances. Thank you, Alan. Alice, would you like to add something?
Bueno, mientras Alan
well, while Alan gave us this master class in 5 minutes, I couldn't stop thinking on my master's degree thesis, where it involved prospective scenarios of management that were traditional management, but they also forced us to go towards the processes of rebuilding. So what it concluded, and this has to do with management and it has to do with the dimensions of governance, is that we say that we are amidst a system of risk management, which is also made up of other systems, such as the system financing for housing, the health system, etc. And we believe that we operate as a system as a whole. But in the study case of my thesis, the analysis for decision-making of a certain system, for instance, health systems, so that a house is demolished, for instance, that order it does not become data for other systems to make decisions. And in that mixture of systems that operate independently, and they should operate together, and where we have information, this doesn't work. Those are the bottlenecks that appear in those scenarios. And as Andrew was saying, if we apply this to the local dimensions of our governments who have been given jurisdiction but not budget, well, this is even worse, because at some point the jurisdiction is not limited, and who is unprotected? Well, the victim, the damaged family, damaged individuals. There have been results, but we still have a lot of challenges ahead of us. Patricia, you have the floor. Thank you. And one of the challenges that I would like to mention is to keep on encouraging the knowledge of risk. The knowledge, but not from the big theories of assessing vulnerability or threats, but on the existing factors. Because if we start getting to know these factors that contribute to vulnerabilities, and this has to do with the planning frameworks, we have the opportunity to know where to reduce vulnerability and to at least not to build more vulnerability or not to increase vulnerability of people. So we have these two big axes to work on. On the one hand, prevention, so as not to build risks, new risks, not to create new risks, and to reduce existing ones. But the existing ones, they start from a natural origin of disaster of natural origin. So one of the keys or the challenges is to increase investment in terms of the knowledge of risk, but so that it is the base for planning, and so that it can be cross-cutting in the vision of the political leader of the country. Thank you, Patricia. Andrew, would you like to add something to this question? Well, I totally agree with what Patricia mentioned, which she said we have to get to improve the knowledge of the risk. And I would like to stress the fact that both risk and resilience are not absolute value, they're relative values, right? So there is nobody says, okay, there are no longer risk or no longer resilience. That is what is called trade-off in English. So we look for an accepted level of risk reduction and increase of resilience. And sometimes this is difficult to explain and to understand, because we can be successful in achieving the reduction of the frequent disasters and the extensive ones, but there will always arise a possibility of having a super intensive one that is different to our resilient schemes that we have created. And sometimes this is difficult to communicate to people. So I believe that education is really essential. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now seeing the answers in Slido from the participants, and we see the two most voted ones are identify, model, and monitoring vulnerability of people and their livelihoods in the face of dangerous events to create capabilities to build resilience. So prospective actions in the face of risk. And the second one is to establish early warning systems so that population and authorities can be prepared and take the due measures, anticipatory measures. Okay, let's go to the fourth and last question. Alice, in the framework of the new Global Agendas 2030, towards where their axis of action should be pointing to reinforce sustainable development and resilience? Well, it's been 8 years. Yes, 8 years, of which the first 5 years and transition to the second, we had the pandemics. It was very significant for certain stakeholders because it seems as if the pandemic evidenced that precisely there are conditions, structural conditions of that were consolidating certain conditions of vulnerability. So the pandemic put that in evidence or highlighted that, and that was significant because that allowed us to reposition in the face of the threat. I mean, the concept of vulnerability in the face of threat. There's still 7 years until we reach 2030. However, I am not, I cannot see the future, so I'm not really sure about the challenges in the next 7 years. And who could have said that we were going to suffer such a huge pandemic that was going to change all our scenarios and that was going to highlight and exacerbate poverty and inequalities? However, I would like to reconnect the Sendai framework and the preamble and the Kyoto Protocol, and I found the sentence, reduction of risk is an investment that is profitable in the prevention of future losses. Reduction of risk, of disaster risk, is a contribution to sustainable development. And after this lesson learned, there were 4 current goals. First of all, to strengthen governance, that's still lacking strength, investment in risk, and keep on supporting preparedness and response. Connecting my answer to what just Patricia and Andrew were saying, and also with other colleagues, finally, we should never forget this last part. Reduction of risk is a contribution to sustainable development. We should never forget that the ultimate goal is sustainable development. So it's not just environmental management per se, or disaster management per se, or risk management per se, but we all need to think of development agenda. We should remember this, and this would just be in itself a huge contribution. And mainly, I would like to ask, what is our contribution? What is this profitable investment? Well, it is to orient development in terms of first action, in terms of understanding risk. That we saw how it was still lacking, and that's why we understand there is no investment in public universities, because when we deliver our reports, they don't want to listen to us. And where we see that risk understanding to reduce uncertainty, that's a percentual likelihood, but it's in the end, it's a contribution so that development is sustainable with resilient, profitable investment, and to avoid losses and impacts. But most importantly, at the level or in terms of living beings, not just human beings, but also animals, livestock in general, and plants. But then the trend has been too focused on the fourth goal. So the agenda is still dominated by preparedness and response, which is not bad in itself. We need that because there's a residual risk and we should be prepared for and plan for that. But sometimes there's also some sort of helplessness, because at the level of discourse, we know our own narratives, but there's something that is not really functioning in practice, and we need to see results in the reduction of damages and losses in any of our countries. Finally, losses and damages, the impact is really taking the best of us. Thank you, Alice. Professor Allen? Very briefly, I think about how would I love to see the institutional thought. I think we all recognize that in 2030 we will still have an holistic mindset with the climate change, development, risk, disaster are all a part of the same sector that is repeated at the national and local level. The only thing I request is like a wish for the future is that we can work better in a more deductive way, in a more systemic way, and to avoid creating problems inductively down up. We are now seeing a development approach informing all the rest. All the rest depends of or is a cause of that we want to change. I don't know how we will do that, but I think that if the concept is correct, then there is an opportunity to keep moving forward. And there are countries that have definitely broken substantially these institutional divisions between climate change and adaptation, risk, and environmental management and development as the big framework of what we are trying to find through the other processes. Thank you very much. Andrew, you have the floor now. Thank you. It really struck me, sorry. It's something that has to do with when we talk about systemic risk, people usually talk about systemic impact of risks and disasters. But I think, and it's something that was reflected in a paper last year with Alan and Gary Jamain in India, that what is more interesting is the systemic risk or systemic generation of risk. When Alice was talking about the pandemic, one of the things that was most striking about the pandemic is that the same population that was most impacted by this pandemic was exactly the same population that in the same country would suffer from flood or insecurity, or in the case of a civil conflict, that would be the same population that would be suffering the most. That's why we talk about systemic generation of risk or systemic production of risk. And my last reflection has to do with the pandemic. We all know how populations with better public health systems at the local level or subnational level were those who were best going through the pandemic. Of course, there were other factors, but that was an important one. Now that the pandemic's over, how many countries are really making some efforts to reinforce or strengthen their public health sector? How can we have an early warning system? What new vaccines could we have? But those basic conditions of vulnerability at the local, community, subnational levels, it's underlying that systemic risk production or generation. So I think that's the line of work in the future. That's all. Patricia? Yes, I think that the issue with the agenda at the different levels, they should be corrected. They should be more oriented towards solving problems that are located in the territories. Ecuador is a very diverse country, thus the needs are also diverse and the risks are also diverse. In this line, if we want to generalize planning frameworks without taking this diversity into consideration, then anything could be written on a paper, but it's never going to become a reality as a solution in the territories, because we need to take national planning and this solution to the actual problems in the territories, all based on risk knowledge and risk understanding and planning for the territories. Thank you very much, Patricia. Related to this fourth question, the audience has chosen strengthening global governance for an effective coordination in the implementation of sustainable development policies and tackling climate change and carbon emissions in all sectors and energetic efficiency in all sectors. Thank you very much for your interaction and your active participation in Slido. I'm sorry because the time is very, very short in order to discuss all the concepts required in risk management and management in itself. As Alice said, the main goal is resilient, sustainable development, but the panelists are at your disposal for you to talk to them directly. Thank you very much for attending this meeting, and thank you to the panelists and experts. And Andrew, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you.
Muy bien, así damos por finalizada esta sesión paralela, lecciones para un
And this is the end of this parallel session, lessons learned for a resilient, sustainable development. Thank you, Alejandra, for your moderating the panel. In the same room, the platform will go on. and have an hour with the midterm review of the implementation of the CENTIME framework. For those of you who will be with us then, I would just like to remind you that the regional platform, in the regional platform, washrooms are for both gents and ladies. On the other hand, to remind you that we promote sustainability and respect to the environment. So we encourage you to avoid using single-use plastic. And for that, we offer you water dispensers, water fountains, and also recycling stations for paper, plastics, and organic waste. Thank you very much. See you very soon.